In the corporate world, power dynamics can shift in an instant. What happens when someone mistakes quiet strength for weakness? When a successful businessman thought he could treat a new colleague like just another pretty face in the office, he had no idea he was about to face someone who had survived Hell Week, mastered combat tactics, and earned her place among America's most elite warriors. One thoughtless gesture, one moment of casual disrespect, one woman who refused to let it slide. This is the true story of how a simple hair pull became the catalyst for the most spectacular career implosion anyone at Morrison & Associates had ever witnessed. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who don't look dangerous at all. Sarah Martinez walked through the glass doors of Morrison & Associates with the kind of confidence that came from surviving things most people couldn't imagine. At 28, she carried herself with perfect posture, her shoulder-length dark hair pulled back in a professional bun, wearing a crisp navy blazer that concealed more than it revealed. To anyone watching, she looked like just another corporate consultant joining the prestigious management firm. They had no idea they were looking at a former Navy SEAL. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave her a moment to survey her reflection in the polished steel doors. The woman staring back looked nothing like the warrior who had completed Hell Week, mastered underwater demolitions, and served 3 tours in classified locations. That was exactly the point. Sarah had spent the last 6 months carefully crafting this new identity, trading her combat boots for heels, her tactical gear for business suits. But underneath the professional exterior, every instinct remained razor-sharp. Morrison & Associates occupied 2 full floors of the downtown Seattle high-rise, its offices a testament to the kind of success that came from helping Fortune 500 companies solve their most complex problems. Sarah had done her homework. The firm was known for its competitive culture, its brilliant minds, and, unfortunately, its boys' club mentality. She was prepared for challenges, but she was also confident in her abilities. After all, if she could handle the psychological pressure of SEAL training, she could handle whatever corporate politics threw at her. Her new boss, Patricia Williams, greeted her in the lobby with a warm smile and a firm handshake. Patricia was in her 40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She had built her reputation as one of the firm's top partners, known for her strategic thinking and no-nonsense approach to business. "Sarah, welcome to Morrison. I'm excited to have you on the team," Patricia said, leading her through a maze of cubicles and corner offices. "Your background in logistics and operations management is exactly what we need for the Henderson project." Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Her official resume listed a decade of experience in military logistics, which was technically true. It just didn't mention that most of that logistics work had been done while jumping out of helicopters or coordinating with special forces units in hostile territory. The military had been surprisingly helpful in creating a civilian-friendly version of her service record, complete with references from officers who understood the need for operational security. The office tour revealed exactly what Sarah had expected: an environment where success was measured in billable hours and client satisfaction, where the walls were covered with awards and photos of executives shaking hands with Fortune 500 CEOs. The firm employed about 60 people across various departments, from junior analysts fresh out of business school to senior partners who commanded 7-figure salaries. "You'll be working primarily with the strategic operations team," Patricia explained as they walked past a conference room where several people in expensive suits were engaged in what looked like an intense discussion. "We handle the most complex organizational challenges our clients face. Think of us as corporate surgeons. We go in, diagnose the problems, and implement solutions that save companies millions of dollars." They stopped at a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. "This will be your workspace for the Henderson project. It's one of our bigger accounts, a manufacturing company that's struggling with supply chain inefficiencies. Right up your alley, given your background." Sarah surveyed the office, noting the strategic advantages: clear sight lines to the elevator, multiple exit routes, and a position that allowed her to observe the entire floor. Old habits died hard, even in corporate settings. "It looks perfect. When do I start meeting the team?" "Actually, let me introduce you to a few key people now." Patricia led her back toward the main office area. "The strategic operations team is small but incredibly effective. You'll be working closely with Marcus Chen, our lead analyst, and Jennifer Walsh, who handles client relations. Both are brilliant at what they do." As they approached a cluster of desks near the center of the floor, Sarah noticed a man in his early 30s leaning back in his chair, feet up on his desk, talking loudly into a phone headset. He was tall and lean, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident smile that suggested he was used to getting his way. His suit was expensive, his watch was flashy, and his entire demeanor screamed entitled privilege. "And that's Brad Hutchinson," Patricia said, her tone becoming noticeably cooler. "He's one of our senior consultants." Brad noticed them approaching and quickly ended his phone call, swinging his feet down and standing up with the fluid motion of someone who was always conscious of making an impression. His smile widened as his eyes settled on Sarah, and she immediately recognized the look. It was the same predatory assessment she had seen from men who thought they could intimidate or charm their way into getting what they wanted. "Well, well," Brad said, extending his hand with an exaggerated flourish. "You must be the new addition to our little family. Brad Hutchinson, senior consultant and generally indispensable member of this organization." Sarah took his hand, noting that he held it just a moment too long and squeezed just a little too tightly. It was a classic dominance move, the kind of thing men did to establish hierarchy. She let him have his moment, returning his grip with just enough pressure to let him know she wasn't impressed. "Sarah Martinez," she replied simply. "Looking forward to working here." "Oh, I'm sure we'll be working very closely together," Brad said, his smile taking on a quality that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Patricia, you didn't tell me you were hiring someone so attractive. Are you sure she's qualified for this kind of work? It can get pretty intense around here." Patricia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah comes with an outstanding military background in logistics and operations. She's exactly what we need for the Henderson account. "Military, huh?" Brad's eyebrows rose with mock surprise. "Let me guess. Army supply clerk? Air Force desk job? Well, don't worry, sweetheart. Civilian corporate work is a whole different animal. Lucky for you, I'm always happy to mentor new team members, especially ones who are easy on the eyes." Sarah felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced when dealing with hostile contacts in the field. But this wasn't a war zone, and she couldn't respond the way her training had taught her. Instead, she simply smiled politely and said, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm confident I can handle whatever challenges come my way." Brad chuckled, a sound that held no warmth. "Confidence is good, but experience is better. Trust me, you're going to need all the help you can get around here. The corporate world can be brutal for people who don't understand how things really work." Before Patricia could respond, Marcus Chen approached their small group. He was a slight man in his mid-20s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the intense focus of someone who lived and breathed data analysis. Behind him was Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her early 30s with red hair and the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she had fought her own battles to earn respect in this environment. "Sarah, let me introduce you to the rest of the team," Patricia said, clearly eager to move away from Brad's uncomfortable presence. "Marcus Chen, our lead data analyst, and Jennifer Walsh, who handles client communications and project coordination." Marcus extended his hand with a genuine smile. "Welcome aboard. Patricia says you have experience with supply chain optimization. I'm looking forward to picking your brain about some of the challenges we're facing with Henderson manufacturing." Jennifer's handshake was firm and professional. "Nice to meet you, Sarah. If you need anything to get settled in, don't hesitate to ask. We've all been where you are now." "See what I mean?" Brad interrupted, placing himself back at the center of the conversation. "Everyone here is so helpful. Of course, some of us are more helpful than others, if you know what I mean." He winked at Sarah, apparently oblivious to the uncomfortable silence that followed. Patricia cleared her throat. "Brad, don't you have the Morrison Industries presentation to finish? I believe it's due this afternoon." "Oh, right," Brad said, snapping his fingers as if suddenly remembering. "Always something urgent around here. But don't worry, Sarah. We'll have plenty of time to get acquainted. I have a feeling you and I are going to be great friends." As Brad walked away, Sarah noticed the way Marcus and Jennifer exchanged glances, the same look she had seen countless times in military units when everyone understood there was a problem but couldn't address it directly. She also noticed the tight line of Patricia's mouth, suggesting that Brad's behavior was an ongoing source of frustration. "Let's continue with the tour," Patricia said, her professional mask sliding back into place. "I want to show you the research library and the client conference rooms. As they walked away from the strategic operations area, Jennifer fell into step beside Sarah. "Don't take Brad's comments personally," she said quietly. "He's like that with everyone, but especially with new women employees. He thinks he's charming, but most of us just find him exhausting." "Has anyone ever complained about his behavior?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral. Jennifer glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "A few people have raised concerns with HR, but Brad's father is James Hutchinson. Should that name mean something to me?" James Hutchinson is one of Morrison & Associates' founding partners and still owns about 30% of the company, Marcus explained, having caught up with their conversation. "Brad's been here for 5 years, and in that time, 3 different women have requested transfers to other teams rather than work with him directly. HR calls it personality conflicts, but everyone knows what's really going on." Sarah absorbed this information without comment, but her mind was already working through the implications. In the military, there were clear chains of command and established procedures for dealing with misconduct. The corporate world apparently operated by different rules, where family connections could override professional standards. The rest of the office tour passed without incident. Patricia showed her the client conference rooms, the research library, and the break room where employees gathered for informal meetings and coffee breaks. Out the tour, Sarah observed the office dynamics, noting which employees seemed confident and engaged and which ones appeared to be walking on eggshells. By lunchtime, she had a clear picture of Morrison & Associates, a successful firm with talented employees, high standards, and at least one significant problem in the form of Brad Hutchinson. She had dealt with problematic personalities before, both in the military and during her transition to civilian life. The key was to remain professional, document everything, and never give anyone ammunition to use against her. Her first official team meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock, which gave her time to grab lunch and review the Henderson manufacturing file. The case was indeed complex. A mid-sized company struggling with supply chain inefficiencies that were costing them millions in lost revenue. It was exactly the kind of problem Sarah had solved dozens of times in the military, just with different stakes and no risk of enemy fire. She spent her lunch hour in the office cafeteria, observing the social dynamics and getting a feel for the company culture. The employees seemed competent and dedicated, with the usual mix of personalities found in any high-pressure environment. What struck her most was how many people went out of their way to avoid sitting near Brad's usual table, where he held court with a small group of junior employees who laughed at his jokes a little too loudly. At exactly 2 o'clock, Sarah arrived at Conference Room B for her first team meeting. Patricia was already there, along with Marcus, Jennifer, and unfortunately, Brad. The Henderson file was spread across the conference table, along with laptops, tablets, and the various tools of modern corporate warfare. "Now that we're all here," Patricia began, "let's dive into the Henderson situation. Sarah, I'd like you to review what we know so far and give us your initial assessment." Sarah spent the next 30 minutes walking through the case file, asking pointed questions about manufacturing capacity, distribution networks, and supplier relationships. Her military experience had taught her to approach complex logistical problems systematically, breaking them down into manageable components and identifying the critical points of failure. "The bottleneck isn't in manufacturing," she concluded, pointing to a flowchart on her tablet. "They're actually producing at near optimal capacity. The real problem is in their distribution network. They're using a hub-and-spoke model that made sense when they were smaller, but now it's creating unnecessary delays and increasing costs." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "That aligns with what our data analysis has been suggesting. But how do we fix it without disrupting their entire operation?" "You implement a phased transition to a regional distribution model," Sarah replied. "Start with their highest volume routes, prove the concept works, then gradually roll it out to the entire network. It minimizes risk while still delivering significant improvements." Patricia smiled. "Excellent. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking Henderson needs to see. Jennifer, can you work with Sarah to put together a preliminary presentation for next week's client meeting?" "Absolutely," Jennifer replied. "Sarah, we can start on that tomorrow morning." Throughout this exchange, Brad had remained unusually quiet, but Sarah could feel his eyes on her. When Patricia asked if anyone had additional questions, he finally spoke up. "I hate to be the voice of caution here," he said, his tone suggesting he relished being exactly that. But are we sure we want to put our newest team member in front of such an important client so soon? Henderson represents a lot of revenue for this firm. Maybe it would be better if someone with more experience took the lead on this presentation. The conference room fell silent. Sarah kept her expression neutral, but she noticed Jennifer's hands clench into fists on the table. Marcus looked uncomfortable, and Patricia's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. Sarah's analysis is solid, Patricia said firmly. Her experience is exactly what this project needs. I'm not questioning her analysis, Brad said, raising his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. I'm just thinking about what's best for the client. Henderson's executives are old-school manufacturing guys. They might respond better to someone who looks more traditional. The implications of his statement hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anger, the same feeling she had experienced when dealing with discrimination in the military. But she also felt something else, a cold, calculating determination to prove exactly how wrong Brad Hutchinson was about her capabilities. I appreciate your concern, Sarah said, her voice level and professional, but I'm confident in my ability to present our findings effectively. If Henderson's executives are primarily interested in results, they'll respond well to solutions that can save their company money. Brad shrugged, as if the matter was of no consequence to him. Well, if that's what everyone wants, just don't say I didn't warn you when things get complicated. The meeting ended shortly after, with Patricia assigning specific tasks to each team member. As everyone gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Sarah noticed Brad hanging back, apparently organizing his files, but actually positioning himself near the door. Sarah, he called out as she approached the exit, mind if I walk with you? I wanted to apologize if I came across as too harsh in there. It's just that I care a lot about this firm's reputation. She had two choices, make an excuse and avoid the conversation, or deal with whatever Brad was planning to say. Her military training had taught her never to retreat from a fight unless it served a strategic purpose. Of course, she replied. They walked down the hallway toward the elevator bank, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors. Brad kept up a stream of small talk about the office, the Henderson account, and the challenges of working in corporate consulting. Sarah responded politely but remained alert, sensing that this conversation was leading somewhere specific. As they waited for the elevator, Brad moved closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intentional. You know, Sarah, I realize I might have given you the wrong impression earlier. I'm actually very supportive of having more diversity on the team. In fact, I'd love to take you out for drinks sometime and show you some of the better places in the city. Consider it a welcome to Seattle gesture. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside. As the doors closed, Brad pressed the button for the parking garage, though Sarah hadn't mentioned where she was going. The enclosed space suddenly felt much smaller. That's very thoughtful, Sarah replied, but I prefer to keep my professional and personal life separate. Brad's smile faltered for just a moment, then returned with increased intensity. Come on, don't be like that. We're going to be working together closely. It's important for team members to build relationships outside the office. Trust me, you'll enjoy it. I know all the best places. The elevator reached the parking garage and the doors slid open. As Sarah stepped out, Brad followed, even though she hadn't invited him to continue the conversation. The parking garage was dimly lit and mostly empty, with concrete pillars casting long shadows between the scattered cars. I really should get going, Sarah said, walking toward her car. Long first day, you know how it is. Of course, Brad said, matching her pace. But think about my offer, okay? I could introduce you to some important people in the city, make your transition to civilian life a lot easier. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him, noting that he had somehow maneuvered them into a section of the garage that was out of sight from the security cameras. How did you know I was transitioning from military to civilian life? Brad's smile became predatory. Come on, it's obvious. The way you sit, the way you scan rooms when you enter them, the way you shake hands like you're ready for a fight. Plus, Patricia mentioned your military background during the meeting. Don't worry, your secret's safe with me. Something in his tone made Sarah's instincts flare. This wasn't just casual conversation anymore. Brad was probing, testing, trying to establish some kind of leverage or control. She had seen similar behavior from hostile contacts who thought they could intimidate or manipulate their way to getting information. Well, this has been enlightening. she said, turning back toward her car. "But I really do need to go." That's when Brad made his mistake. As Sarah turned away, he reached out and grabbed a handful of her hair, giving it a playful tug while saying, "Don't be so serious all the time, sweetheart. Life's too short not to have a little fun." The moment his hand touched her hair, everything changed. Every instinct Sarah had developed through years of training screamed danger. In her world, unexpected physical contact was a precursor to violence, and her body reacted accordingly. But this wasn't a battlefield, and Brad wasn't an enemy combatant. This was a colleague who had just made a catastrophically poor judgment call. Sarah went completely still, her voice dropping to a tone that would have been recognizable to anyone who had served under her command. "Remove your hand." Now, Brad, apparently oblivious to the danger he was in, actually laughed. "Oh, come on! It was just a joke. You need to relax." He was still holding her hair. "This is your final warning," Sarah said, her words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Remove your hand, or I will remove it for you." For the first time, Brad seemed to register that something was wrong. The playful expression faded from his face, replaced by confusion and then annoyance. But instead of letting go, he tightened his grip slightly, as if to reassert his control over the situation. "Jesus, what's wrong with you?" "It's just hair. Don't be such a—" He never got to finish the sentence. Sarah's training took over, and Brad Hutchinson learned the hard way that some women were more dangerous than they appeared. The lesson was about to cost him everything. What happened next took less than 3 seconds but would reshape the trajectory of multiple careers at Morrison & Associates forever. Sarah's response was controlled, precise, and devastating. Her left hand swept up and locked Brad's wrist in a grip that immediately cut off circulation to his fingers, forcing him to release her hair. Simultaneously, she pivoted on her left foot, using Brad's own momentum against him as she applied pressure to specific nerve points that she had memorized during countless hours of hand-to-hand combat training. Brad found himself face-first against the concrete wall of the parking garage, his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that made any movement impossible without excruciating pain. The entire sequence had been executed with surgical precision, designed to neutralize a threat without causing permanent damage. In Sarah's world, this was considered a measured response. "Let me explain something to you," Sarah said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "In the military, we have a saying, hands on, hands off. It means that the moment you put your hands on someone without permission, you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. Do you understand me?" Brad tried to struggle, but any movement only increased the pressure on his twisted arm. "Are you insane? Let me go!" "This is assault." Sarah applied just enough additional pressure to make her point clear. "No, this is a lesson in consequences. What you did was assault. This is self-defense. There's a very important legal distinction between the two." She held him there for exactly 10 seconds longer, enough time to ensure the lesson was thoroughly absorbed, then released him and stepped back to a safe distance. Brad staggered away from the wall, cradling his arm and staring at her with a mixture of shock, rage, and something that might have been fear. "You're finished," he snarled, his face flushed with humiliation. "Do you have any idea who I am? Who my father is? You just assaulted a senior member of this firm. I'm going to have you arrested, fired, and blacklisted from every decent company in this city." Sarah regarded him with the same expression she might have given a minor inconvenience. "You're welcome to try. But before you do, let me give you some free advice. When you tell your story to HR, to your father, to the police, or to anyone else, you're going to have to explain exactly what led up to this moment. You're going to have to admit that you followed a female colleague to an isolated location, ignored her clear request to leave her alone, and then put your hands on her without permission. Are you prepared for that conversation?" The color drained from Brad's face as the implications sank in. In his anger and embarrassment, he had been thinking about revenge, but he hadn't considered how his own actions would sound when described to others. The parking garage security cameras might not have captured the incident itself, but they had certainly recorded him following Sarah from the elevator. "It was just a joke," he said, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "I barely touched you." "A joke," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "You followed me to an isolated location, ignored my clear discomfort, and then grabbed my hair while calling me sweetheart. Which part was supposed to be funny?" Brad opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his privileged life, he was facing someone who couldn't be intimidated, bought off, or charmed into overlooking his behavior. Sarah Martinez was a problem he had never encountered before, and he had no idea how to handle her. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued, her tone remaining professionally neutral. "You're going to walk away from this conversation and think very carefully about whether you want to escalate this situation. Because if you do, I'm going to make sure everyone understands exactly what kind of person you are. And something tells me that once people start looking closely at your behavior, they're going to find a pattern that goes back much further than today." She turned and walked toward her car, leaving Brad standing alone in the parking garage, still trying to process what had just happened. As she drove out of the garage, she could see him in her rearview mirror, standing motionless between the concrete pillars, his expensive suit wrinkled and his perfect hair disheveled. Sarah had been in enough combat situations to know that this was far from over. Brad Hutchinson wasn't the type of man who would accept defeat gracefully, especially not from someone he considered beneath his social status. He would regroup, consult with allies, and launch a counterattack. The only question was how long it would take and what form it would assume. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment overlooking Puget Sound, reviewing the day's events with the same analytical approach she had once used to plan military operations. She had 3 strategic advantages. Her military record provided her with credibility and legal protections. Her professional competence was already established through her work on the Henderson account. And most importantly, she had witnesses to Brad's inappropriate behavior during the office meetings. Her main vulnerabilities were her newness to the company, her lack of allies in the corporate hierarchy, and the undeniable fact that Brad's family connection gave him significant influence within the organization. In a straight fight between a senior consultant with family ties and a new employee with a military background, the outcome would depend largely on how skillfully each side managed the narrative. Sarah opened her laptop and began documenting everything that had happened, from Brad's inappropriate comments during their first meeting to his behavior in the parking garage. She included specific times, locations, and witnesses wherever possible, creating a detailed record that would be invaluable if the situation escalated to formal complaints or legal action. As she worked, her phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Walsh. "Hope your first day went well. Looking forward to working on the Henderson presentation tomorrow. Coffee at 8 a.m.? Sarah smiled slightly. Jennifer's message was professionally appropriate, but also suggested a genuine desire to collaborate. Having allies would be crucial in the coming days, and Jennifer's experience navigating the firm's politics could prove invaluable. She responded, "Coffee sounds perfect. Looking forward to it." The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that matched Sarah's cautious mood. She arrived at the office 30 minutes early, using the time to observe the morning routines of her colleagues and get a better feel for the office dynamics. The strategic operations area was mostly empty at 7:30, giving her a chance to organize her workspace and prepare for the day ahead. Jennifer arrived promptly at 8, carrying 2 coffee cups and wearing the kind of professional smile that suggested she had important information to share. They walked to a quiet corner of the office cafeteria, far enough from other employees to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard. "So," Jennifer said, settling into her chair, "I heard through the grapevine that you and Brad had an interesting conversation yesterday evening." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "News travels fast around here." "Faster than you might think," Jennifer replied. "Brad came in this morning looking like he'd been hit by a truck. His usual swagger is completely gone, and he's been making very quiet phone calls all morning. Marcus thinks something big happened, but he's too polite to ask directly." Sarah sipped her coffee, considering how much to reveal. Jennifer seemed trustworthy, but office politics could be treacherous, and she couldn't afford to have her words misinterpreted or taken out of context. "Let's just say that Brad and I have different ideas about appropriate workplace behavior," she said finally. "I made my position clear, and I don't think we'll have similar misunderstandings in the future." Jennifer leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Sarah, I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll keep it confidential. You're not the first woman Brad has targeted. In the 5 years he's been here, there have been at least 6 incidents that I know of. Most of the women involved either transferred to other departments or left the company entirely rather than fight it. What about HR? Surely someone must have filed complaints." 3 formal complaints, all dismissed as personality conflicts or miscommunications. Brad's father doesn't just own 30% of the company, he's also best friends with the HR director. It's a rigged game, and everyone knows it. Sarah absorbed this information, feeling her strategic assessment shift. If Jennifer was telling the truth, then Brad's behavior was part of a larger pattern that had been enabled by the company's leadership structure. That changed the dynamics significantly, but it also created opportunities. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, staring into her coffee cup. "Because you're different. Yesterday, when Brad was making those comments about the Henderson presentation, you didn't back down. You didn't apologize or try to minimize his concerns. You just stated your position and moved forward. I've never seen anyone do that with him before. And that makes you think I can succeed where others have failed? I think you can do something none of us have been able to do. Fight back effectively. But you need to understand what you're up against. This isn't just about one inappropriate colleague. This is about a system that's designed to protect people like Brad Hutchinson at the expense of everyone else." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was listed as B. Hutchinson, and the message was brief. "We need to talk. Conference room C, 9 a.m. Come alone." Jennifer noticed her expression change. "Everything okay?" Sarah showed her the message. "It looks like round 2 is about to begin. Do you want me to come with you? Or we could reschedule and make sure Patricia is available."
"No," Sarah said, standing up and gathering her things.
"This is something I need to handle myself. But Jennifer, if I'm not back in the office by 10 o'clock, I want you to call Patricia and tell her exactly what we discussed this morning." Jennifer nodded grimly. "Be careful, Sarah. Brad might not be physically dangerous, but he's politically ruthless. And he's had all night to plan whatever he's going to say to you." Conference room C was located at the far end of the office, in a section that was typically used for confidential client meetings. As Sarah approached, she could see Brad through the glass walls, sitting at the head of the conference table with several file folders spread out in front of him. He was wearing another expensive suit, and his hair was perfectly styled, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he held his left arm. She entered the room and closed the door behind her, noting that Brad had positioned himself strategically so that his back was to the wall, and he had clear sightlines to both the door and the windows. It was actually a tactically sound position, which surprised her slightly. "Sarah," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." She remained standing, keeping her distance from the table. "I prefer to stand. You said you wanted to talk, so talk." Brad's smile was different from the predatory expression she had seen yesterday. This smile was colder, more calculating, and infinitely more dangerous. "I spent most of last night thinking about our conversation in the parking garage, and I've come to some interesting conclusions." He opened one of the file folders and removed a single sheet of paper which he slid across the table toward her. "I did some research on your background, Sarah Martinez. Very impressive military record, by the way. 8 years in the Navy, with the last 4 spent in what the official records describe as Special Operations Support. That's interesting terminology, don't you think?" Sarah glanced at the paper without moving closer. It appeared to be a summary of her military service record, though she couldn't see the details from her current position. The fact that Brad had been able to obtain any information about her classified service was troubling but not entirely surprising given his family connections. "Special Operations Support covers a lot of different roles," she replied neutrally. "Oh, I'm sure it does," Brad continued, his tone becoming more confident. "But combined with your physical capabilities, which you demonstrated so impressively yesterday, it paints a very specific picture. I'm guessing Navy SEALs or something similar. Am I close?" Sarah said nothing, but something in her expression must have confirmed his suspicions because his smile widened. "I thought so," he continued. "Which brings me to my point. You're a trained killer, Sarah. Someone who has been taught to use lethal force in the service of your country. And yesterday, you used those skills against a civilian colleague in a corporate parking garage. How do you think that's going to play out when HR investigates this incident?" He opened another folder and removed what appeared to be a printed email. "I've already filed a formal complaint describing how you followed me to the parking garage, made threatening statements, and then physically assaulted me when I tried to engage in friendly conversation. I have photographs of the bruises on my arm, and I'm prepared to press criminal charges if necessary." Sarah felt a cold clarity settle over her, the same mental state she had experienced before high-stakes military operations. Brad had spent the night crafting a strategy, but he had made several critical errors in his approach. The most important was that he was assuming she would be intimidated by his threats. "That's an interesting story," she said, "but it has a few problems, such as the security footage that shows you following me from the elevator, despite the fact that I never invited you to continue our conversation, such as the fact that you somehow knew I was going to the parking garage, even though we never discussed our destinations, such as your history of inappropriate behavior with female colleagues, which I'm guessing HR will be very interested to revisit once this incident brings it back into the spotlight." Brad's confident expression flickered slightly. "That's all circumstantial, and my father has already spoken with the HR director about your violent tendencies. They're very concerned about having someone with your background in a client-facing role." "Your father?" Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "James Hutchinson, founding partner and 30% owner. I'm sure he was very concerned when you called him last night to explain how you ended up with bruises on your arm. What exactly did you tell him about the circumstances?" For the first time since she had entered the room, Brad looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I told him the truth, that you attacked me without provocation." "The truth," Sarah said, finally moving closer to the table. "Let me tell you about the truth, Brad. The truth is that you followed a female colleague to an isolated location. The truth is that you ignored her clear requests to leave her alone. The truth is that you grabbed her hair without permission while calling her sweetheart. And the truth is that when she defended herself, you immediately ran to your father instead of taking responsibility for your actions." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow managed to be more intimidating than shouting would have been. "But here's the most important truth of all. I'm not going anywhere. You can file all the complaints you want, make all the threats you can think of, and call in every favor your family has accumulated over the years. It won't matter, because I'm not some scared intern who will quietly transfer to another department to avoid making waves." Brad straightened in his chair, his face flushing with anger. "You have no idea what kind of power my family has in this city. One phone call from my father, and you'll never work in corporate consulting again. We can destroy your career before it even starts." Sarah smiled, and Brad suddenly realized he had made yet another mistake. This wasn't the smile of someone who was worried about her career prospects. This was the smile of someone who had been waiting for him to reveal exactly how far he was willing to go. "One phone call," she repeated. "That's interesting, because it suggests that your father is willing to use his business relationships to retaliate against someone who defended herself from his son's inappropriate behavior. That's the kind of conversation that might be very interesting to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, don't you think?" The color drained from Brad's face as the implication sank in. In his anger and desperation to reassert control, he had just described a clear pattern of retaliation that would be illegal under federal employment law. Worse, he had done it in front of the one person who was most likely to use that information against him. "I didn't mean—" he started, but Sarah cut him off. "You meant exactly what you said. And now we both know where we stand." She straightened up and moved toward the door. "Enjoy your meeting with HR, Brad. I'm sure it will be very enlightening for everyone involved." As she reached for the door handle, Brad called out one last desperate threat. "This isn't over, Martinez. You might think you've won, but you have no idea what you've just started." Sarah paused at the door and looked back at him. "You're right about one thing. This is just the beginning. But you're wrong about who's going to win. You see, Brad, I've spent my entire adult life in situations where failure meant death. Corporate politics is just a game by comparison, and you've already shown me all your moves." She left him sitting alone in Conference Room C, surrounded by his carefully prepared files and his increasingly desperate plans. As she walked back toward her office, Sarah reflected on how much the situation had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been a new employee hoping to build a successful civilian career, Today, she was at war. The difference was that this time she was fighting on her own terms, with her own rules, and with an enemy who had no idea how dangerous she really was. The real battle was just beginning. By 10:30 that morning, the entire atmosphere at Morrison & Associates had shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood office politics. Sarah noticed it immediately when she returned from Conference Room C. The way conversation stopped when she walked past, the careful glances exchanged between colleagues, and the nervous energy that seemed to permeate the strategic operations area. Jennifer was waiting at Sarah's desk, her expression tense. "Patricia wants to see you in her office immediately," she said quietly. "And Sarah James Hutchinson arrived about 20 minutes ago. He went straight to the executive conference room with Patricia and the HR director." Sarah nodded, having expected this development. Brad had clearly escalated the situation to his father, which meant the company's leadership was now involved. That changed the dynamic significantly, but not necessarily in ways that favored the Hutchinson family. "Has anyone spoken to you about what happened yesterday?" she asked. "Not yet, but I have a feeling that's coming soon. Are you ready for this?" Sarah checked her watch. She had spent the morning preparing for exactly this scenario, reviewing her documentation and mentally rehearsing her responses to the questions she expected to face. "As ready as I can be. Wish me luck." Patricia's office was located on the executive floor, accessible by a separate elevator that required a key card. As Sarah rode up, she used the time to center herself mentally, drawing on the same psychological preparation techniques she had used before high-stakes military briefings. The key was to remain calm, stick to the facts, and never allow emotion to cloud her judgment. The executive conference room was larger and more opulent than the meeting spaces on the lower floors, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of downtown Seattle. 3 people were seated around the polished mahogany table. Patricia Williams, looking professionally composed but clearly stressed. Margaret Chen, the HR director, a severe-looking woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. And James Hutchinson himself. James Hutchinson was exactly what Sarah had expected. A man in his early 60s with silver hair, an expensive suit, and the kind of presence that came from decades of wielding corporate power. He was taller than his son, with sharper features and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. When Sarah entered the room, he studied her with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to sizing up potential threats and opportunities. "Miss Martinez," Patricia said, "please have a seat. I believe you know Margaret Chen from HR. This is James Hutchinson, one of our founding partners." Sarah took the chair across from James, noting that he had positioned himself at the head of the table in a classic power position. She kept her posture relaxed but alert, her hands folded calmly in front of her. "Ms. Martinez," James began, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "We have a very serious situation here. My son has filed a formal complaint alleging that you physically assaulted him yesterday evening in the company parking garage. These are extremely serious allegations, and I want to hear your version of events before we decide how to proceed." Margaret Chen opened a file folder and positioned a digital recorder on the table. "This conversation is being recorded for documentation purposes. Do you consent to this recording?" "I do," Sarah replied, her voice steady. She had been hoping they would record the conversation, as it would provide legal protection for her statements and prevent any later attempts to mischaracterize her words. "Now then," James continued, "according to Brad's complaint, you followed him to the parking garage after yesterday's team meeting, made threatening statements about your military background, and then physically assaulted him when he attempted to engage in friendly conversation. He has photographs of significant bruising on his arm, and he's considering pressing criminal charges. What do you have to say about these allegations?" Sarah took a moment to organize her thoughts, then began her response with the same precision she had once used in military debriefings. "Mr. Hutchinson, those allegations are not only false, but they represent a complete inversion of what actually occurred. I did not follow your son to the parking garage. He followed me, despite my clear attempts to end our conversation and leave the building." She paused, noting the slight narrowing of James's eyes. He was clearly expecting either denials or emotional outbursts, not a calm, methodical recounting of events. "After yesterday's team meeting," Sarah continued, "your son approached me near the elevator and suggested that we continue our conversation. I politely declined, stating that I preferred to keep my professional and personal life separate. When the elevator arrived, I pressed the button for the parking garage. Your son pressed the same button, despite the fact that I had not invited him to continue the conversation, and had not mentioned where I was going. Margaret Chen was taking notes, writing quickly as Sarah spoke. Patricia remained silent, but Sarah could see the tension in her jaw. During the elevator ride and subsequently in the parking garage, your son continued to make unwanted advances, including suggesting that we go out for drinks and offering to introduce me to important people in the city. I repeatedly attempted to end the conversation and leave the area. Your son then positioned himself between me and my car, and when I turned away from him, he grabbed my hair without permission while calling me sweetheart. James's expression had remained neutral throughout her account, but Sarah noticed his fingers drumming silently on the table, a sign of either impatience or stress. At that point, she continued, I felt threatened and responded with the minimum force necessary to remove his hand and create distance between us. I did not pursue, strike, or threaten your son after he released me. I simply got in my car and left the premises. The conference room was silent for several moments. Margaret Chen finished her notes and looked up expectantly. Patricia was staring at the table, her expression unreadable. James leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with renewed interest. That's quite a different story from what my son described, he said finally. You're essentially claiming that Brad initiated inappropriate contact and that you were acting in self-defense. I'm not claiming anything, Mr. Hutchinson. I'm stating exactly what happened. And I should mention that security cameras in the parking garage likely recorded your son following me from the elevator, which would corroborate at least part of my account. Margaret Chen made another note. We'll certainly review any available security footage as part of our investigation. James nodded, but his attention remained focused on Sarah. Miss Martinez, I've had a chance to review your personnel file this morning. Your military background is quite impressive. Navy Special Operations, multiple tours overseas, commendations for valor. That's exactly the kind of experience we value in our consulting work. Sarah sensed a shift in his tone and remained cautious. Thank you, sir. However, he continued, it also raises questions about your ability to function in a civilian workplace environment. Military training emphasizes aggressive responses to perceived threats. What assurance do we have that yesterday's incident won't be repeated with other colleagues? It was a clever question, designed to make her military experience seem like a liability rather than an asset. Sarah had anticipated this line of attack and was ready with her response. Mr. Hutchinson, my military training emphasized disciplined responses to actual threats, not perceived ones. Yesterday, your son grabbed my hair without permission, after following me to an isolated location and ignoring my repeated requests to end our conversation. In military terms, that would be classified as assault, and my response was proportionate and controlled. If I had reacted aggressively, your son would have required medical attention. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. James's eyes sharpened, and Sarah could see him reassessing his approach. This wasn't going according to his plan. Are you threatening my son, Ms. Martinez? Not at all, sir. I'm simply pointing out that my training has taught me to use the minimum force necessary to neutralize threats. Yesterday's response was carefully calibrated to stop unwanted physical contact without causing injury. That's not aggression. That's restraint. Patricia finally spoke up, her voice carefully neutral. James, I think we need to consider all aspects of this situation before reaching any conclusions. Sarah's work on the Henderson account has been exemplary, and the client presentation is scheduled for next week. Yes, about that, James said, turning his attention to Patricia. Given the current circumstances, don't you think it would be prudent to have someone else handle the Henderson presentation, at least until this matter is resolved? It was exactly the move Sarah had expected. Remove her from the high-profile project, isolate her from important clients, and gradually push her out of the company. She had seen similar tactics used against military personnel who challenged the status quo. With respect, Mr. Hutchinson, Sarah interjected, removing me from the Henderson account based on unsubstantiated allegations would constitute retaliation under federal employment law. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission takes a very dim view of companies that punish employees for defending themselves against workplace harassment. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Margaret Chen stopped writing and looked up sharply. Patricia's eyes widened slightly, and James Hutchinson's face went completely blank, the expression of a man who had just been checkmated by someone he had underestimated. That's a very serious accusation. Martinez, Margaret said carefully. It's not an accusation, it's a statement of fact. If I am removed from projects, denied opportunities, or subjected to any other adverse employment actions as a result of defending myself against your son's inappropriate behavior, that would constitute illegal retaliation. I'm simply making sure everyone in this room understands the legal implications of the decisions you're about to make. James stood up abruptly, his carefully controlled demeanor finally cracking.
Miss Martinez, you seem to be under the impression that you can threaten this company and its executives without consequences.
Let me assure you that Morrison & Associates has access to the finest legal representation in the city, and we will not be intimidated by someone who has been employed here for exactly 2 days. Sarah remained seated, her voice level.
Mr. Kurtzit.
Hutchinson, I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply ensuring that all parties understand their legal obligations under federal employment law. If you choose to view that as a threat, perhaps you should consult with your legal representation about why that might be concerning. The silence that followed was deafening. James Hutchinson stood at the head of the conference table, his face flushed with anger and frustration, while Sarah sat calmly in her chair, meeting his gaze without flinching. It was a moment that crystallized everything about their respective positions. He was used to wielding power through intimidation and influence, while she was prepared to fight using knowledge, preparation, and an absolute refusal to be cowed. Margaret Chen cleared her throat. I think we need to take a step back and approach this situation more systematically. James, I need to conduct individual interviews with all relevant parties before we can make any decisions about disciplinary actions or project assignments. That includes speaking with other team members who may have witnessed inappropriate behavior. What other team members? James demanded. This is between my son and Ms. Martinez. Actually, sir, Sarah said quietly, your son's behavior during yesterday's team meeting was witnessed by Patricia, Marcus Chen, and Jennifer Walsh. They observed him questioning my qualifications based on my gender, making inappropriate comments about my appearance, and suggesting that I might not be capable of handling client presentations. That behavior, combined with what happened in the parking garage, establishes a clear pattern of harassment. Patricia nodded reluctantly. Sarah's right, James. Brad's comments during the meeting were problematic. I should have addressed him at the time. Margaret made more notes, her expression becoming increasingly serious. I'll need to interview all the witnesses as part of a comprehensive investigation. Until that's complete, I don't think we should make any changes to current project assignments. James realized he was losing control of the situation. His attempt to intimidate Sarah into backing down had failed spectacularly, and now the company was facing potential legal liability that could cost millions in damages and negative publicity. Worse, his son's behavior was being scrutinized by multiple witnesses, which could reveal a pattern of misconduct that had been covered up for years. Fine, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Conduct your investigation. But Ms. Martinez, I want to be very clear about something. Morrison & Associates has been successful for 30 years because we maintain the highest standards of professionalism and client service. If your presence here becomes disruptive to our business operations or client relationships, we will take whatever action is necessary to protect our company's interests. Sarah stood up, matching his height and maintaining eye contact. Mr. Hutchinson, I want to be equally clear about something. I came to Morrison & Associates to build a successful civilian career using the skills I developed during 8 years of military service. I have no interest in causing disruptions or damaging client relationships. However, I also will not tolerate being harassed, intimidated, or retaliated against by anyone, regardless of their position in this company or their family connections. I hope that's understood by everyone in this room. The two of them stared at each other across the conference table, the tension palpable. Finally, James nodded curtly and gathered his materials. Margaret, I want a preliminary report on your investigation by Friday morning. Patricia, please ensure that all team members understand the importance of maintaining confidentiality during this process. He paused at the door and looked back at Sarah. Ms. Martinez, I hope for everyone's sake that your commitment to professionalism proves to be genuine. Morrison & Associates is not the kind of place where people play games or settle personal scores. After he left, the atmosphere in the conference room remained tense. Margaret Chen packed up her recorder and files, avoiding eye contact with both Sarah and Patricia. "I'll be scheduling interviews with the team members over the next few days," she said. "Please make sure they understand this is a confidential internal investigation." When Margaret was gone, Patricia finally relaxed slightly. "Sarah, I have to ask, are you sure you want to fight this battle? James Hutchinson is not someone you want as an enemy, and Brad clearly isn't going to back down gracefully." Sarah considered her response carefully. "Patricia, I respect your concern, but I learned something important during my military service. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who think they can intimidate you into surrendering without a fight. Brad Hutchinson made a serious mistake yesterday, and his father is making an even bigger mistake today by trying to cover it up instead of addressing it properly." Patricia nodded slowly. "I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, this could get very ugly for everyone involved." As Sarah rode the elevator back down to her floor, she reflected on how much the situation had escalated in just 24 hours. Yesterday morning, she had been a new employee focused on making a good impression and building professional relationships. Today, she was in an open conflict with one of the company's most powerful families, with her career and potentially her legal status hanging in the balance. But she had faced worse odds before, in places where the stakes were literally life and death. Corporate warfare was brutal in its own way, but it followed rules and procedures that could be understood and exploited. Brad and James Hutchinson were used to winning through intimidation and influence, but they had never faced someone who was prepared to fight back with equal determination and superior tactics. When she arrived back at her desk, Jennifer was waiting with a concerned expression. "How did it go?" "About as well as could be expected," Sarah replied. "Margaret Chen is conducting a formal investigation, which means she'll want to interview you and Marcus about Brad's behavior during yesterday's meeting." Jennifer nodded grimly. "I've been thinking about that meeting all morning. Brad's comments were definitely inappropriate, but I'm worried about what happens if we speak up." This company has a long memory for people who cause problems. "Jennifer, I understand your concerns, but I need you to understand something. This isn't just about me anymore. If we let Brad get away with this, he's going to continue harassing other women until someone gets seriously hurt. You said yourself that this has been going on for 5 years. How many more women are going to be forced to transfer or quit before someone finally stops him?" Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "You're right," she said finally. "I've been telling myself that staying quiet was the smart career move, but really I was just being a coward. If Margaret Chen wants to interview me about Brad's behavior, I'll tell her exactly what I've seen over the past 5 years. What about Marcus? Marcus is solid. He might be quiet, but he has a very strong sense of right and wrong. If Brad has been creating a hostile work environment, Marcus will speak up about it." As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared at Sarah's cubicle, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Sarah, I just heard from Patricia that HR is conducting an investigation into Brad's conduct. Is this about what happened during yesterday's meeting?" "It's about more than that," Sarah replied. "But yes, your observations during the meeting may be relevant. Margaret Chen will probably want to interview you in the next few days." Marcus nodded slowly. "Good. Brad's behavior has been getting worse over the past year, and frankly, I've been wondering when someone was finally going to call him on it. I'm prepared to tell HR exactly what I've witnessed, regardless of the political implications." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward her new colleagues. In the military, she had learned to value people who would stand with you when the situation became difficult, and it was clear that both Jennifer and Marcus fell into that category. "There's something else you should know," Marcus continued, lowering his voice. "I was in the break room about an hour ago, and I overheard a conversation between Brad and 2 of the junior analysts. He was trying to convince them that you're mentally unstable, that your military background makes you dangerous to work with. He's actively trying to turn people against you." Sarah wasn't surprised, but the information was useful. What was their response? Mixed. One of them seemed to buy into what Brad was saying, but the other one pointed out that your analysis of the Henderson account was the most insightful work they'd seen in months. "I think Brad's campaign is going to backfire if he's not careful. People here respect competence more than anything else, and your professional work speaks for itself. That afternoon, Sarah threw herself into the Henderson project with renewed focus. Whatever happened with the investigation, she needed to ensure that her work performance remained unquestionably excellent. The best way to counter Brad's whisper campaign was to demonstrate her value to the company through results that couldn't be disputed. She spent the rest of the day developing a comprehensive implementation plan for the regional distribution model she had proposed, complete with cost-benefit analyses, risk assessments, and detailed timelines. By 5 o'clock, she had created a presentation that would not only solve Henderson Manufacturing's immediate problems, but position them for significant long-term growth. As she was preparing to leave for the day, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You made a big mistake yesterday. This isn't over." Sarah stared at the message for a moment, then forwarded it to her personal email account and saved a screenshot. If Brad was foolish enough to send threatening messages, she was more than happy to add them to her growing file of evidence. Every mistake he made strengthened her position and weakened his. She was beginning to understand that Brad Hutchinson was not nearly as smart as he thought he was. His privileged background had taught him that problems could be solved through intimidation and family influence, but it hadn't prepared him for dealing with someone who was immune to both tactics. Every move he made revealed more about his weaknesses and gave her additional ammunition for the battles ahead. As Sarah drove home through the Seattle traffic, she reflected on the day's events with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated a complex tactical situation. The investigation would take several days to complete, giving her time to strengthen her position and prepare for whatever Brad and his father might try next. But she also knew that the most dangerous phase of the conflict was still ahead. The Hutchinsons were backed into a corner, facing the possibility of public humiliation and significant legal liability. Desperate people made desperate choices, and she needed to be ready for anything. The war was far from over, but Sarah Martinez had survived much worse than corporate politics, and unlike her enemies, she was just getting started. The next 3 days at Morrison & Associates passed in a state of barely controlled tension, like the calm before a hurricane that everyone could feel approaching but no one could predict. Sarah maintained her professional routine, working diligently on the Henderson account, while Margaret Chen conducted her interviews with the relevant team members. The office buzzed with whispered conversations and careful glances, as everyone tried to gauge which way the political winds were blowing. On Thursday morning, Sarah arrived early to find an unexpected sight. Brad's usual desk in the strategic operations area was empty, and his personal items had been cleared away. Jennifer noticed her looking and approached with information that she had clearly been waiting to share. "Brad hasn't been in the office since Tuesday," she said quietly. "Word is that James told him to take some time off while the investigation is ongoing. But there are rumors that he's been meeting with lawyers downtown, preparing for some kind of legal action." Sarah wasn't surprised by this development. Removing Brad from the office during the investigation was a smart move that protected both the company and the integrity of the process. But the mention of lawyers was concerning, suggesting that the Hutchinson family was preparing to escalate the conflict beyond the corporate level. "Have you been interviewed by Margaret yet?" Sarah asked. "Yesterday afternoon. She was very thorough, asked about every interaction I've witnessed between Brad and female employees over the past 5 years. I told her everything. The inappropriate comments, the unwanted advances, the way he uses his family connection to avoid consequences." Marcus was interviewed this morning, and he looked pretty grim when he came out of her office. Before Sarah could respond, Patricia approached their informal huddle with the kind of urgent expression that meant important news. "Sarah, I need to see you in my office immediately. We've just received some information that changes everything." Sarah followed Patricia to her office, noting the closed door and the way Patricia immediately activated a white noise machine, precautions that suggested highly sensitive information was about to be shared. "I just finished a very interesting conversation with our head of security," Patricia began, settling behind her desk. As part of the investigation, Margaret requested all security footage from Monday evening. What they found is quite remarkable. She turned her computer monitor so Sarah could see the screen, which displayed a series of security camera timestamps from various locations throughout the building and parking garage. The cameras clearly show you leaving the team meeting and heading toward the elevator bank at 5:47 p.m. Brad can be seen leaving the same area at 5:49 p.m., following the same route. The elevator camera shows him joining you, despite having no apparent reason to go to the parking garage. His car is assigned to a different level. Patricia clicked to the next timestamp. This is where it gets interesting. The parking garage cameras show you walking directly to your car, while Brad follows about 20 feet behind. You can see him positioning himself to intercept you, and when you try to continue toward your vehicle, he moves to block your path. Sarah watched the silent footage with professional detachment, noting how clearly it demonstrated Brad's predatory behavior. The cameras captured everything except the actual moment when he grabbed her hair, which occurred in a blind spot between two concrete pillars. Most importantly, Patricia continued, the audio from the elevator is quite clear. Brad can be heard making several inappropriate comments about your appearance, suggesting that you go out for drinks with him, and implying that you need his protection to succeed at the company. Your responses are professional and clearly indicate that you want the conversation to end. Sarah felt a wave of relief. The security footage corroborated her version of events completely, while simultaneously demonstrating that Brad's complaint was not only false but represented a deliberate attempt to turn his own misconduct against his victim. There's more, Patricia said, advancing to another timestamp. After your car left the garage, Brad remained in the parking area for another 12 minutes, during which time he made several phone calls. Security was able to enhance the audio enough to determine that at least one of those calls was to his father. The implications were clear. Brad had immediately contacted James Hutchinson to coordinate their response, probably crafting the story that would later become his formal complaint. It suggested premeditation and conspiracy, both of which would be devastating if the situation escalated to legal proceedings. Patricia, I need to ask you something directly, Sarah said. Where does the company stand on this? I know James Hutchinson has significant influence here, but the evidence seems pretty conclusive. Patricia was quiet for a moment, her expression reflecting the internal struggle that Sarah had expected. Sarah, I'm going to be completely honest with you. 24 hours ago, I thought this situation was going to destroy your career and possibly damage the entire strategic operations department. James Hutchinson is not just an owner. He's been the driving force behind this company's success for 3 decades, and his opinions carry enormous weight. She paused, organizing her thoughts. But the security footage changes everything. What Brad did was not only inappropriate, it was predatory, and his subsequent attempts to portray you as the aggressor constitute a clear pattern of retaliation and cover-up. Margaret Chen has already briefed the senior partners, and the consensus is that the company cannot and will not protect Brad from the consequences of his actions. Sarah felt a surge of cautious optimism, but she had learned not to celebrate victories until they were completely secure. What about James? Is he going to accept that conclusion? That's where things get complicated, Patricia admitted. James is facing an impossible situation. As a father, he wants to protect his son. As a business owner, he knows that defending Brad's behavior could expose the company to massive legal liability. The senior partners have made it clear that Morrison & Associates cannot afford to be seen as a company that tolerates sexual harassment, regardless of family connections. Before Sarah could respond, Patricia's phone buzzed with an urgent message. She read it quickly, her expression becoming tense. That was Margaret. James has called an emergency meeting of all senior partners for this afternoon. She thinks he's going to make one final attempt to control the narrative and protect Brad's position with the company. Sarah considered this information strategically. An emergency partners meeting suggested that James was preparing a major move, possibly an ultimatum that would force the other partners to choose between supporting his son and protecting the company's interests. It was a high-risk strategy that could backfire spectacularly if he overplayed his hand. What do you think he's planning? I'm not sure, but I have a bad feeling about this. James didn't build this company by accepting defeat gracefully. If he thinks Brad's career is finished, he might decide that the best option is to take you down with him. That afternoon, Sarah worked alone in her office while the senior partners met behind closed doors on the executive floor. The rest of the strategic operations team tried to maintain normal productivity, but the atmosphere was thick with tension and speculation. Everyone understood that whatever happened in that meeting would determine the future direction of the company and potentially affect all their careers. At 4:30, Sarah's phone rang with a call from the HR department. Margaret Chen's voice was professional but strained when she asked Sarah to report to the executive conference room immediately. Miss Martinez, please bring any documentation you may have regarding this incident, as well as your personal attorney if you have one available. The mention of legal representation sent a chill down Sarah's spine. In her experience, companies only suggested that employees bring lawyers when they were expecting the situation to become adversarial. She quickly gathered her files and headed for the elevator, her mind racing through possible scenarios. The executive conference room contained more people than Sarah had expected. In addition to Patricia, Margaret Chen, and James Hutchinson, there were 3 other senior partners she didn't recognize, plus 2 men in expensive suits who were obviously attorneys. The atmosphere was formal and hostile, like a military tribunal or a corporate war council. James gestured to an empty chair across from the assembled group. Martinez, please have a seat. We need to discuss the resolution of this situation. Sarah noted that she was the only person in the room without legal representation, which put her at a significant disadvantage. But she had faced worse odds before, and she wasn't about to be intimidated by corporate power plays. Before we begin, she said, I'd like to understand the purpose of this meeting. Am I being disciplined? Terminated? Are you presenting me with some kind of settlement offer? One of the attorneys, a sharp-faced man with silver hair, spoke up. Ms. Martinez, this meeting is an attempt to resolve the current dispute in a manner that serves everyone's best interests. We're prepared to offer you a very generous severance package in exchange for your resignation and a mutual non-disclosure agreement. Sarah kept her expression neutral, but internally she was analyzing the tactical situation. A severance offer meant they were afraid of her, either because of the legal liability she represented or because of what she might reveal about the company's culture. The non-disclosure agreement was particularly telling, suggesting they wanted to buy her silence about Brad's behavior. What kind of severance package? She asked. The attorney consulted his notes. 12 months' salary, continuation of health benefits, positive references for future employment, and a commitment that Morrison & Associates will not interfere with your career prospects in any way. In exchange, you would agree not to discuss the events of this week with anyone outside this room, including potential employers, media representatives, or law enforcement agencies. It was indeed a generous offer, probably worth close to $200,000 when all benefits were included. For someone who had been employed for only 4 days, it represented a significant financial windfall, but Sarah understood that accepting the offer would mean abandoning her career goals and allowing Brad Hutchinson to continue harassing other women without consequences. And if I decline this offer? James leaned forward, his expression hardening. Ms. Martinez, I want to be very clear about your situation. While the security footage may support some aspects of your story, it doesn't change the fact that you physically assaulted my son. We have photographs of his injuries, medical documentation, and witness statements. If this matter proceeds to criminal prosecution, you could face serious legal consequences that would destroy any chance of a civilian career. Sarah recognized the threat for what it was, a last-ditch attempt to intimidate her into accepting their terms. But James had made a critical error in his approach. By threatening criminal prosecution, he had revealed that he was willing to use the legal system as a weapon against someone who had defended herself from his son's misconduct. Mr. Hutchinson, I appreciate the offer, but I have a few questions before I can consider it seriously. First, what happens to Brad? Does he face any consequences for his behavior? The attorney answered quickly, asking, Mr. Churchill, Bradley Hutchinson has agreed to undergo sensitivity training and will be subject to additional oversight regarding his interactions with female colleagues. He will also be required to issue a formal apology for any misunderstandings that may have occurred. Sarah almost laughed at the carefully worded response. Sensitivity training and an apology for misunderstandings. What about the 3 other women who filed complaints against him over the past 5 years? Do they receive similar apologies? Margaret Chen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but it was James who responded, his voice cold with anger. Those complaints were investigated and resolved appropriately. They have no bearing on the current situation. Actually, they have significant bearing, Sarah replied. They establish a clear pattern of predatory behavior that your son has been allowed to continue because of his family connections. The security footage from Monday evening doesn't show an isolated incident. It shows the